it's important to have specific recommendations to be able to make sure that the government takes concrete steps towards improving human rights, but also to be able to monitor whether or not those recommendations were implemented, those steps were taken. So one challenge is the fact that specificity is diminishing from one cycle to another. Another problem is that, and it's a bit technical, but for example, if your country received recommendations in the first cycle on, let's say, torture in detention, and these recommendations was made by Denmark. Now, at the second cycle, you probably want Denmark to make the same recommendation if nothing happened, or to at least make a recommendation related to that. But what we see is that actually states don't really do that. From one cycle to another, the one that makes the recommendation, they change the issue, they change the act, they speak about something else. So they don't follow up from one cycle to another. We see that only one recommendation out of 5 in the first cycle was linked into the second cycle. So if you were working on issues in the first cycle, your country received good recommendation, and then you want them to make the same or to make something similar, then it's a bit disappointing to see that states don't really feel like speaking about the same issue. We spoke, for example, to some countries who said, well, we don't feel like repeating the same recommendations because we don't want to be seen as being too pushy, etc., etc. But we think it's counterproductive for the UPR because you need to bring accountability and make sure that states get told the same thing over and over again, so the pressure is mounting, etc., etc. So that's another challenge of the Geneva process, let's say. And then there was 2 other issues: the lack of follow-up mechanism. So if your country doesn't do anything between 2 reviews, the UN won't publish a report about it. Nobody will say anything about it. It's up to NGOs actually to say something about it, because there's no system to actually monitor whether your government has done anything between 2 UPR. My organization had a program that looked into between 2 reviews, so basically what happened 2.5, 3 years after the review. But that's just an NGO doing it on the side with our small capacities, but the UN doesn't do that. So when your country will come back again, there won't be a full assessment of what actions were made, what recommendations were implemented or not. So there's a kind of a vague information about this. There's difficulty to actually know what really happened in the country. And it's difficult for the recommending states, the states making the recommendations to your country, to know if their recommendations were implemented or not. Now, looking at the national level, there's 2 main points that I would like to raise, and I will go into details in the first one, in the challenges in the implementation. First is the challenges that touch upon the government and civil society. And this, at the coordination level, it's quite important because the UPR touches upon a lot of different issues in the country. And it requires coordination, obviously, among the governments, but also among the other actors. So for the governments, is to make sure that the ministry, for example, looking into minorities or education, are knowledgeable about the UPR process and know what the government committed them to do. Because usually the UPR is handled by the Ministry of Justice or Foreign Affairs, and those ministries have to convince the other ministries that they also have things to do and that they have commitments. And if the Ministry of, let's say, Education was not involved in the UPR process before the review, then they don't necessarily feel the need to implement those recommendations they have no connection with. And then for NGOs, it's all obviously to work together. I said at the beginning that it's one of the achievements. It has been done, but it's not necessarily on a broad scale, and it's not concerning all countries. And it's always to keep that coordination, to have a leading NGO within a coalition that will basically carry the organization. And usually NGOs, let's say, are more prone to write reports, to come together to publish a report. But then after the review, the coalition basically fades away, disappears. The leading organization doesn't necessarily has the UPR on its agenda anymore. So if that leading organization doesn't carry the coalition anymore, then the coalition doesn't meet and there's not really work on the follow-up. And it's been witnessed across countries and regions where the coalition after the UPR is difficult to lead and support. Now, for the government, another change which also obviously impacts on NGOs is the change of government situation in the country. Obviously, if there's a change of government, the following government might not feel really compelled by what the previous government committed to do. But for NGOs, it can be an opportunity. We want to be a bit positive because recommendations that were rejected maybe now can be accepted by the new government. So there's always opportunities as well. And then challenges for implementation, I mentioned that, is the vague recommendations, confusing recommendations for the state and the review because they don't know necessarily what to do with those. And we heard cases in countries where the UN was trying to help the government to implement the recommendations, and the people in the UN didn't know what to do with the recommendations because they were going in different directions and not very clear enough for the UN and the state and review to know what to do with those. And then it's obviously harder to assess whether what was done was enough and necessary. And then mostly looking at NGOs, and for you that's probably what's important, is there's a lack necessarily sometimes of a comprehensive strategy, and it goes back to what I said. NGOs can be good at submitting a report because they know the UPR is coming up, so they have this on their agenda. It's let's say the next deadline, but then once the review is done, and it's quite normal, they have other priorities. So it's difficult to keep the UPR on their agenda, to keep the momentum, but also to, when they start writing the report, to think of, okay, what are we going to be doing in 2-3 years on the UPR process? So that's why it's important to have a comprehensive strategy, to think not only of in terms of writing a report, but then what to do after that recommendations have been made, how to work on the implementation. Challenges for civil society is to access the government. There's in certain countries disrespect for civil society, and it's sometimes difficult for local NGOs to work with the government. One way of doing it, obviously, to counter that is to sometimes to have recommendations made at the UPR that will say, work with your civil society. For example, it was indirectly, but in Costa Rica, the UK made a recommendation to Costa Rica to have a national plan of action and to engage broad consultations to draft this national plan of action. And in drafting this plan, the government engaged with civil society, and that really helped facilitated dialogue between civil society and the government. So because they had this recommendation to consult, this extra push, then the government did it, and then civil society were able to engage with the government. Another problem is the lack of information about what the government is doing. It's quite interesting. Sometimes also the government doesn't know. One ministry doesn't know what the other ministries are doing. But civil society also don't know what the government is doing. So it's difficult to monitor this and then to report on that. Another challenge is making sure that the UPR is known among civil society, but also among parliamentarians, for example, which are key actors. It should be key actors of the UPR process. The UN usually says that between 60 to 80% of recommendations require parliamentary action to be implemented. So parliamentarians have an important role to play, obviously, in this, and they don't necessarily know what the UPR is or what their governments committed them to do. So NGOs face this lack of knowledge from the different actors in the country. also NGOs can also counter that also by talking to parliamentarians. They can also approach embassies in countries. So the embassies of countries that made those recommendations that they work on. So if I took the example of Denmark, then if there's a Danish embassy in the country, NGOs should go see that Danish embassy to say, you made that recommendation, it's been 2 years now, nothing happened, etc., etc. They can try to ask for support from embassies in the countries to financial, political support to help them work on the implementation of recommendation. And more generally, obviously, the challenges that NGOs face is the lack of resources and time and funds to work on implementation. It's as I said, there might be more interest in writing a report for the UPR to feed the UPR, and it's very important to do it. But there might be less interest and funds to work on the implementation. So that's one challenge that NGOs are facing, and I think working with other partners, working with the embassies, with the UN is one way to counter that. And that's something that we've heard quite a few times from civil society on the difficulty to engage in the follow-up. And to, for example, if there's a coalition and there's no money to actually organize meetings, publish reports, etc., etc. So that's a reality that NGOs are facing in the UPR. So this was it for my presentation on the achievements and challenges of the UPR, including civil society engagement in the process. I wanted to leave time for questions, so now the floor is yours. If there's anything you'd like to share or to ask me about the UPR process, you're very much welcome. You can ask in French or in English, obviously. And this is all contact details. You have our website and my email. And on the website, you should find a lot of information on the UPR process, including a database with all the UPR recommendations, and you can access by country receiving the recommendations, by country making the recommendations. You can access also by issue, etc., etc. So there's a wide range of information you can access on the database, but also on the rest of the website with documents in different languages, explanations of the process, etc., etc. So thank you, and please don't be shy. Yes?